Pai nosso, que estais no céu, santificado seja o vosso nome. Venha a nós o vosso reino, seja feita a vossa vontade, assim na terra como no céu, assim na terra como no céu. O pão nosso de cada dia dai-nos hoje, ó Senhor. Perdoai as nossas dívidas, assim como perdoamos aos nossos devedores. Não deixeis cair em tentação, mas livrai-nos de todo o mal. Não deixeis cair em tentação, mas livrai-nos de todo o mal.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for all of you who has joined us in the series of talks promoted by the United States Spiritist Federation every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Today we will have our special guest, KIRSTEN MELO, talking about the ways to end suffering with Joanna de Angelis. But before we turn it over to KIRSTEN, let's do our initial prayer to prepare for the talk. So let's join together and thank our spiritual friends for this opportunity to be here today, asking them to inspire our special guest, that she can bring us the lessons and that we have our open minds and hearts to understand the lessons and also to be able to take this into our daily lives. Thank you again. Please stay with us and help us in our inner transformation. So be it. So now that we are connected to the spirituality, we welcome KIRSTEN. Hi, KIRSTEN. Nice seeing you.
Hello, hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. And before we turn it over to you, let's take a look into getting to know more about KIRSTEN. KIRSTEN MELO is an active board member at the Spiritist Society of Baltimore. She was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to Spiritist parents, and was a part of the Spiritist Society of Philadelphia before moving to Maryland in 2011. So today she's in Maryland. She has participated in the Spiritist Medical Congress and multiple Spiritist symposiums here in the US. Professionally, she's a registered nurse with her Bachelor's of Science degree with experience in critical care, case management, and utilization management. Again, thank you, and we'll be here listening to you, KIRSTEN. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And I just wanted to thank the United States Spiritist Federation for inviting us and for allowing us to share this beautiful message of Spiritism, especially these books that are now being published in English from Joanna de Angelis. It's such a blessing. So let's just make sure that you're able to see, there you go, my PowerPoint. So let me just double check my audio because I hear a little bit of, okay, there we go. The feedback is gone. Well, thank you all for who are joining us this lovely morning. So if you've joined us and you're looking at this topic and you're thinking, you know, how do I end my suffering, or how do I mitigate what I'm going through? So if you aren't already thinking that, I want you to bring to your mind something that you've been struggling with, or something that you've been going through. It could be any assortment of things. It could be something that comes to your mind right now, or it could be something that's more troubling to you from your past. But the reason why we mention that is because we want you to have that mindset. So we're focusing on our inner selves, and we're not deflecting, and we're not thinking about, oh, how can this person use this information, or that person, or my spouse, or my neighbor, or my friend. But we want to take this opportunity to really utilize this information that Joanna is sharing with us. When we talk about suffering, there's a lot of stigma that's out there. You know, when we talk about physical suffering, we generally understand that it's validated throughout science and just modern society, social norms. But when we talk about deep emotional suffering, it's not always the case. You know, modern science, modern psychology, recent studies, and the recent push is towards validating, emotional pain. So let's also keep that in mind as well, that we are multifaceted, multidimensional beings, and we've lived many, many lifetimes. So given that not so small fact, we bring with us so much baggage and so much history from different lives. And even if you might say, well, I don't remember, I have no memory, nothing. This life alone, and the time that we're living in this beautiful year of 2020, there are plenty enough of struggles in this stage of the earth that we're now that we could refer back to and need assistance to deal with. We wanted to bring to mind a pediatrician, actually. Her name is Dr. Nadine Burke Harris. You actually can find her. You can Google her. She's actually an American-Canadian pediatrician. She practices out of the state of California, and she's one of the first, and she was appointed one of the first Surgeon Generals in 2019. I believe she's one of the first African Americans as well, and she's relatively young. The reason why we're bringing her, and the reason why we wanted to start out with her, is because she is doing the work of a pioneer. And she's not widely recognized as much as we believe that she should be. You can find her. She gave a beautiful TED Talk maybe about a year or so ago. But the work that she is, I muted myself, technical difficulties. The work that she has been doing, not only for the state of California, but for the entire United States and the world, is monumental. The research that she's bringing to light is so important for us to tie into Spiritism, to tie into what we're going to be talking about today, for us to give validation to those who are suffering on any spectrum in any way. So what is the research that she brought to light? It's actually research on childhood trauma. She brings to us, and you can, like I said, you can go and you can Google, you can find tons of information about her, about the works. And I believe it has a book out. Like I said, she even has a TED Talk. And she brings to us this knowledge and this idea that what we endure through emotional trauma early on, we carry with us. Now, as a spiritist, how do we interpret that? Well, we know we live many lifetimes, and we know that we don't suddenly get wiped as a blank slate when we reincarnate. So ultimately, we're bringing with us a lot of these different traumas. So that goes without saying that many of us, if not everyone, has to some degree is suffering in some way, shape, or form. So we wanted to bring to you this particular book called Plenitude. If you don't already have it, it is in English. It's a wonderful book by Joanna Angelis. And we wanted to bring to you some of her words that are very inspiring, but this presentation specifically is actually going to go straight to the point of ways to end suffering. You know, Joanna's best known for her philosophical, beautiful words, and indeed, her words are beautiful. But we are sharing her words, and we believe she kind of gets straight to the point of what suffering is and how to combat it. So a couple things we're going to be going over is one of the quotes she brings from this wonderful psychologist from years ago. His name is Dr. Carl Gustav Jung. And one of the famous quotes he says the following, and Joanna actually shares this in her book. He said, "Man has to cope with the problem of suffering. Eastern man wants to get rid of suffering by casting it off, and Western man tries to suppress suffering with drugs." But suffering has to be overcome, and the only way to overcome it is to endure it. We learn that from him, Christ crucified. So he brings to us our model and guide, Jesus, that the only way for us to really overcome and triumph over anything is to go through it, process it, learn from it, and move on from it. Because there's two sides of the coin, as Dr. Jung shares here, that either, in the Eastern philosophy, we just want to completely get rid of our suffering, or in the Western philosophy, we want to drug it away, which we'll talk a little bit about, because we don't want our viewers to get this misunderstanding that utilizing allopathic medicine, modern medicine, if you will, is wrong. There's nothing wrong with it. It should be used when appropriate, when prescribed by a professional. But the point we believe he's trying to make here is that we can't be at either extreme. We can't try to, or want to just get completely rid of it, or just to numb ourselves with some form of medication and not deal with it. Ultimately, we have to find a balance of trying to process our suffering, understand it, grow from it, at the same time find ways to mitigate it and end our suffering as much as possible. So Joanna goes on to say that suffering is actually a sickness, but there are several effective ways to cure it. She says some attenuate it, others are harmless, but very few are actually effective. So some work, some really don't work, but they don't really harm us. And then there's a small percentage that actually work to end suffering. Let's talk about that. She says the real cure only happens when the therapy uproots its causes. We have to be able to uproot the cause of our suffering. There's an old, I think, Buddhist saying or something to that effect, where it's like, if you're shot with a poison arrow, first you have to take the arrow out and then work on healing the wound itself. Because if you try to heal yourself from the poison, but the arrow is still in, you're defeating the purpose, because you're constantly going to be running against time. So we have to be able to uproot it and completely remove it out of ourselves. But let's dive in a little bit further with Joanna. She says, in order to end suffering, excuse me, she says it's essential to acquire a responsible attitude capable of going back to the origins of the suffering, analyzing them and working them out with a planned, purposeful direction. Now, for those of you who might be listening to her words and thinking and reflecting on your own personal sufferings or traumas, you might be thinking, well, how do I even begin to do that? You might even think, I've been going through it for so many years, or it's so deeply pushed down inside of myself, or I don't even know where to begin, Kirsten. Where do I even start? Well, we're going to talk about that. But it's important for us to first understand that we must be willing to face and go through and endure what we're going through. One of the scariest and hardest things for people that are going through suffering, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, it's just that fear of actually facing it and dealing with it. This fear that we may crumble, this fear, if you really ask yourself, well, what am I so afraid of? That we will just disintegrate into nothingness? If I face this, it'll be too much to bear. Oftentimes it's that very fear that keeps us, it's our own fear that keeps us from truly embracing our challenges and getting out of it what we need to learn to progress forward. If you remember nothing else from our presentation today, this is probably one of the bigger takeaways from today's presentation, that from Joanna's words. Three things: educating one's thoughts, disciplining one's habits, and being sure of one's goals are skillful means for ending suffering. Otherwise, therapies and techniques become mere palliative. What does she mean? If we're not working on educating our thoughts, people always talk about change your thoughts, change your life, which is valid, but it's more than that. It's more profound. We need to educate our thoughts. What's in essence is educating ourselves, because we are the source of our thoughts primarily. So if we're not working on educating ourselves, our thoughts, or becoming disciplining our habits, and setting goals for ourselves, the therapies and any multiple techniques that we're utilizing are not going to be curative. They're just going to be what we call in modern medicine palliative, which is just a fancy word to just say it's just to make you comfortable, but doesn't really cure or fix anything. It's just to keep you in a space where you're stable enough to just barely live. But who wants to live a life like that, where you're barely living? You're unable to fully experience joy and connection, and just be able to appreciate the small things in life, because we might be so caught up in our suffering, in our traumas, in what have you. Who doesn't want to be free from that? I don't know anyone that says, oh no, I want to stay in my suffering. No one says that. Unless you truly have gone over the edge and are very, very severely ill, and that's a whole other discussion in and of itself. But even deep down everyone's soul and heart, no one says, yeah, I want to suffer, I'll stick with it. No one feels that way. We all want a relief, a release, to be free from the burden of that emotional baggage that comes along with physical or emotional suffering. So a couple of questions to ask ourselves that we want us to reflect as we're listening to Joanna's words. How do I go about educating my thoughts? How can I do that? And the reason why we're leaving this as a rhetorical question in a way is because it might look different for everyone. Some people love to read, some people love to listen to audiobooks, and there might be other different ways of educating yourselves in a different fashion or facet. Just depends upon your personality. So we don't want to share a specific thing and say, well, you must read, when maybe audiobooks are better for you, or listening to a talk, or listening to music and meditating, or maybe it's all those things, and just different days. But as they say, different strokes for different folks. So we have to find what works best for and resonates with our heart and our soul. And how does one go about disciplining our habits? How do I discipline my habits? What does that look like? What are my habits? And we can only assume that probably she's talking about the more not so great habits that we have, but probably also all habits. How do I just become a disciplined person? What does that look like for me? It might be something completely new, and let's just throw this out there and let you know that none of what Joanna is saying is easy to implement. If you had any expectation today that you'd come to this or be a part of this talk today and say, yes, finally I can find my way out of my suffering, or I can help myself, great, but it's not going to be something as easy as, flipping a switch. This is going to take diligent work. There will be times where some days are harder than others. And being a spiritist, we know that not only we're dealing with our own emotions and energies and setbacks, but we also can be influenced not only by others around us in the physical realm, but our old spiritual friends, those who perhaps don't like us, maybe some who do like us, but want us to remain as they are. So do indeed expect there to be challenges and trip-ups and setbacks as you're working on yourself. But the main point is for us not to stop, to continue to persist. And a third thing she says are very important, setting goals. So what are my life goals? What are my short and long-term goals for myself? Maybe not just in a professional sense, in a deeply personal sense. What goals do I have for myself? One of the worst things we could do is listen to Joanna's words and not actually at least take down some notes or make a mental note or actually put this into practice. Because otherwise it becomes like going to, I believe, that place in Paris, the Louvre. We go there and we see these beautiful paintings, but that's all that they are, just beautiful paintings, beautiful words hanging on a wall or in a book. We need to take that painting, take it into our lives, and try it on. It's kind of like when you're trying on a new shirt for the first time or a new pair of shoes. It's kind of maybe a little bit weird or funny or might not fit quite right, but much like a new pair of shoes, you got to kind of break it in a little bit because you got to get used to it. If you've never worked on yourself, or if you've never actively set goals or looked to become more disciplined or educate yourself with more intention, it might be kind of weird at first. Like it's, you haven't always been doing that. Maybe you have in small bursts here and there, and that's okay. That's totally fine. We're all at our own level. We all need to go at our own pace. She also brought us to think about this famous Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist who I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, Dr. Viktor Frankl. And he's also a Holocaust survivor. And he has a famous quote where he says, "Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how." To us, his words have much more weight than the average person because he's a Holocaust survivor. So when we talk about trauma and suffering, he is a person, one of many, that really caught the brunt of suffering during the Holocaust. So for someone of that magnitude to have that perspective and to tell us in so many ways that this is how he was able to survive, was that he had a why to live, a purpose, a sense of purpose, a sense of being, goals that he wished to accomplish, that his circumstances were not going to be the death of him. And I don't just mean that in a literal sense, but an emotional sense, because sometimes we go through trauma that doesn't physically kill us, but we become so traumatized that it's like we become so disconnected from everything. And we're not going to get into the deep understanding of trauma. Maybe that'd be a talk for a different day. But we want to be able to understand and see and look at people who've been through severe traumas and suffering and hardships and overcome them and how they did those things. He's a perfect example. Divaldo Franco, one of the most renowned Brazilian spiritists and mediums, quotes him a lot, or he has in his past, in some of his books that he's written. So another, I guess, little sidebar, I could say that if you're looking for inspirational reading, a lot of some things that he's published are very inspirational as well, and really coincide beautifully with the beliefs that Spiritism that Joanna is sharing here today. So it's important, those three things, that we're educating our thoughts, that we're disciplining our habits, and that we're setting goals for ourselves. And especially doing those three things gives us purpose and gives us meaning in life. One of the things that happens when we are going through extreme suffering, we begin to detach and we begin to feel a sense of lack of meaning in our lives. We might feel that life itself has lost meaning, purpose, joy, for any millions of reasons that has caused it. But Joanna calls us back and reminds us these are the steps we can begin to take. You know, depending upon your level of suffering that you're currently in, sometimes when you're in the midst of it, it's quite difficult to even make sense of anything. Sometimes you have to start somewhere small, something small. Something as small as taking care of yourself, self-care, showing yourself some compassion and grace for what you've been through. Just some things for us to think about as we journey on through these words of Joanna de Angelis. She goes on to say, and brings Christ, Jesus, and she said, Jesus' recommendation about love as a way to end suffering is of indisputable effectiveness, in that love is the generator of values responsible for human happiness. She says, love mellows individuals responsible and incites them to uplifting attitudes about life. It leads them to think before making decisions, considering which ones are most compatible with the morals and longings of the heart, never wanting for their neighbor what they would not want to experience for themselves. They can take on commitments of prosperity without harm to themselves or others. So in essence, it's like as if love recalibrates our mind, our emotions, for us to really refocus, make wise decisions, and really allow us to get to the core of our heart and our beliefs. So if Joanna is reminding us that one of the biggest recommendations that Jesus brought to us still echoes this, is about love and how effective love therapy is. And in different books of Joanna de Angelis, you actually can, at the top of my head, I can't recall, but I can bring it to you guys later, is this idea of love therapy and utilizing love as a therapeutic tool to endure our suffering and to experience life in a more productive way. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have heard of, maybe in a distant sense, this story back in the 1980s of Pope John Paul II and his assassination attempt. And these photographs that we're showing here on our screen became so widely shared because soon after Pope John Paul II was recovering from being shot by this gentleman here, he actually went to go and visit him. Obviously, he was in jail, but he went to visit him because he wanted to extend forgiveness and love. A monumental step in the right direction. And Joanna shares with us, forgetting about wrongs and abandoning plans to revenge. It's a way to be released from significant suffering. So some people might think or have this false idea that forgiveness means to be okay with what the offender has done to you, or to, push it aside and pretend like it never happened. That's not at all what she's saying here. Not in the least bit. She says, holding on to depressing ideas, resentment, generate sickness that delacerate the body's tissues, wreak havoc on emotions. Joanna's advice is to extend fraternal understanding to wrongdoers and considering them to be unsound individuals, ignorant of the moral disease that consumes them. She's not saying for us, and we just took some words out of this particular book. She goes more into depth where she clarifies that it's not about being okay with what that a person who offended you has done, or thinking what they have done is okay. No, it's acknowledging what has happened, acknowledging that it was wrong, but also freeing ourselves. Because when we hate, when we want revenge, even if we just sort of fantasize about it, we stay energetically and emotionally connected to that offender, to that perpetrator, to that person who's a wrongdoer who clearly is not well. We remain shackled to them. So let's think about that for a second. Do you really want to be shackled any longer to a person that's ill and that has transgressed the laws of God and has, in layman's terms, those simplest terms, done bad things to you? No, because we don't want to stay at that negative energy level. We don't want to stay in that vibration, because then we won't be able to tap into all the multiple possibilities that comes along with elevating our thoughts and our minds, and also being able to be happy. It's very difficult to experience the full spectrum of joy and the small enjoyments of life, family, friends, when a lot of our energy and our thoughts are so tied up in this negative source. So Pope John Paul is a great example. There also is another example, and we've shared it before in one of our talks, of a gentleman who actually, him and his wife, his pregnant wife and 2 children, after dinner one night, were driving to get ice cream for dessert, very common dessert here in the US and probably other places. Must have been about 6 or 7 o'clock at night, not that late. And as they were driving to the ice cream place, or to pick up ice cream, out of nowhere, they get hit head on by another car by a 17-year-old who happened to be leaving a party drunk. And immediately when the impact happened, it instantly killed this man's pregnant wife and 2 kids. So the actual story he shares, this gentleman who went through this severe situation, trauma, he says that, initially, of course, due to the impact, he was knocked unconscious. And then at some point he came to, and as soon as he said he came to his senses and kind of woke up, and he looked over at his wife, and he turned around in his back seat and he saw his 2 children. He said, I knew they were gone. And he said, for a split second, this thought came to my mind, he said, that as he looked out and he could see the young man in the car who had hit them, unconscious still, he thought he had 2 options. He could spend the rest of his life hating this person, or he could right now in that moment to make the decision and decide to forgive, because he knew that this young person, was not well. Nobody gets into a situation like that who is balanced and well. So what ended up happening, of course, this father, who was now widowed, of course, he forgave this young man. And we're saying, of course, because we're getting to a point, of course, this young man still had to go to jail. He served time. However, this gentleman and this young man spent the rest of a better part of 10 plus years. They wrote a book together about forgiveness. They went on speaking tours, speaking to young teenagers about the dangers of drinking and driving, as well as just larger groups of people who are looking to understand and better grab a deeper understanding of forgiveness. Now, as we're telling this story, you might not feel the entire impact, but you can actually Google, we don't have his name off the top of my head, but you can Google the story of man who forgives a teenager of drunk driving accident. And it's all over the internet. Happened quite a number of years ago, maybe 5 or more years ago when it happened. But it's very inspiring things for us to think about, that we do have that choice. Now, maybe we're not all at that level that that father was, and that's okay. Forgiveness is a process. It's a process of healing. It's a process of understanding ourselves, the situation. So don't forget to extend some grace to yourself as well in this process of just growing and learning and living this life. We are way too many times too hard on ourselves. But we'll go into that in a second here. And this is where Joanna talks about this other uplifting endeavors, self-forgiveness. You know, because there might be those of us who are watching, listening to this talk, you might say, Kirsten, well, I'm the perpetrator, or I'm the one who did something wrong. I feel terrible. I don't know how to move on. Self-forgiveness is extremely important. Joanna says, individuals must grant themselves the opportunity to openly right their wrongs for the sake of their own conscience, as well as for the sake of those whom they have harmed. So self-forgiveness is not, you know, pretending like what I did never happened, or just looking for those just to forget about what I did and let's just move on. No, it's not about that. It's about taking ownership, responsibility, and looking for ways to repair. She goes on to say that self-forgiveness, the ideal consciousness of self-forgiveness, is not based on mechanisms of false tolerance for one's errors. Instead, it represents a clear indication of mental and moral growth, which provides correct guidance in relation to actions for personal and general well-being. So it's facing ourselves, our situation, and seeking out the proper guidance for us to get well, to get back on track. Pure and simple repentance, if not accompanied by a reparative action, is as ineffective and harmful as the absence of it. So we can be very regretful and sorry for what we've done. We can repent for the wrongs that we've done. But if we don't have in place ways to repair that, now perhaps you might say, Kirsten, you know, this person is no longer in my life, or they won't give me the opportunity, which we'll touch on here in a second. Or, you know, I've done this one thing and I'm not sure how to go about it because I can't undo it. Well, for instance, if for some reason you may have committed an abortion when you didn't know any better, the situation you were placed in, you made that decision. So one of the ways that you can repair, or what would be considered potential reparative action, is to work with children, or to adopt, or to offer your services to children or young babies that are in need. Nowadays, we have this amazing opportunities of volunteer work throughout the US. There are great organizations. And if you're just not sure where to start, any type of work within a charitable organization is actually quite helpful. And there's a lot of science and research behind the gifts in forgiveness, the gifts in giving, and just volunteerism, and how good it is for our mental and emotional and physical well-being. So that alone, that in and of itself has healing properties. Something for us to think about. And Joanna says, complete self-forgiveness as making a thorough analysis of the factors that led to the reproachable action. So in layman's terms, understanding what brought us to that point. So we're going to need to be doing some self-evaluation, some digging, and examining other alternatives that we could have taken, which would not have produced the adverse effects. What other option could I, or should I have done instead of what we did? And being willing to adjust one's attitude, releasing oneself from the uncomfortable injunction of conflicted guilt. There's a great book by Joanna called Existential Conflicts, and she has a whole chapter where she dives into the nitty-gritty of understanding guilt. And guilt has its purpose in our evolutionary process. There's a point for it. We need to be able to acknowledge, say, whoa, that was wrong, I shouldn't have done that. But if we begin to ruminate and get stuck in guilt, it becomes like this never-ending loop of despair and anguish. We have to be able to adjust our attitudes, understand what led us to that point, what other options we could have taken, and begin the process of repairing. She goes on to say that if one has decided on self-renewal but finds your victim unreceptive, this should not be a reason for renewed friction, but a stimulus for pursuing one's salutary purpose, arming oneself with more patience and tolerance in order to face the reaction of the other, who, for now, is also sick, but unwilling to be cured of it. What does that mean? So what if you might be saying, Kirsten, well, I went to person A, and well, I tried to apologize, but well, they don't want to hear it, so just forget it. I don't even want to deal with it anymore. It's not the right attitude to take. It's easy to take that attitude because then we, take away any personal responsibility and just say, well, forget it. I can't fix it, whatever. No, Joanna says we should use that ever more so as a stimulus to really work on ourselves and work on our patience and tolerance. If those who we're trying to right our wrongs with, if we even have that opportunity, are rejecting us, we need to already be aware that that is a possible factor. But we cannot allow that to deter us from moving forward, from working on ourselves, from healing ourselves, from forgiving ourselves, and going through the process of becoming a better person. And she ends her particular, if you will, dissertation on ending suffering. She says, the actual end of suffering, therefore, occurs when, with its cause eradicated, the consequences naturally disappear. So there is hope. There is hope, my friends, out there for us. Whether your suffering is small, not too bothersome, but a little bit bothersome, or it's to the extent where we need to see a professional and go into therapy or receive medical attention or what have you. No matter what end of the spectrum we're on, there is hope. We don't have to remain in this air, in this pattern of, in cycle of constant anguish in our hearts. Because that thought alone is one of the things that can drive people to take their life. Because the very nature of certain illnesses, or mental illnesses, is that it makes us believe that the pain is never ending. If you read in the book Memoirs of a Suicide by Ivone Pereira, by the medium Ivone Pereira, we can understand the despair of those who have taken their lives. Because for them, there is no end to the suffering. But it's a fallacy. It's a false interpretation that these sort of a lie that we tell ourselves, or we allow ourselves to fall into that abyss. But one of the greatest things we can offer another human being is hope. Hope that things will get better, that there is a way to end suffering, and that suffering has an expiration date. Pain has its purpose in our lives to teach us, to grow, to become more self-aware. Even now, as we're enduring this pandemic, and some people might joke around, I've heard some jokes here and there, memes going around, because a lot of our young folks and our teenagers are really experiencing a lot of emotional pain because they weren't able to live out their expected high school experience, or maybe as parents or caretakers, we are saddened for our kids because they couldn't experience certain things. Those are all very valid. Those are very valid and real things. But that pain that we're experiencing, let's not invalidate that or invalidate someone else's pain because you think, if that's the only thing you're enduring in life, you're lucky. You can't compare apples to oranges. It's unfair that we do that. We have to extend compassion and grace and know that any bit of pain or suffering we experience has its purpose in teaching us. What is the lesson we need to learn? Is the question we should ask ourselves. So again, if there's nothing else you take away from today's talk, just a reminder of educating one's thoughts, disciplining our habits. And that can mean, again, any variety of things. It can look different to each person. We don't want anyone to feel like it has to look like one thing or the other. But also remember to set goals for yourself. Work on your thoughts, changing your habits, working towards disciplining them, and setting goals is a great place to start. So I thank you all so much for giving us this opportunity, this space to share with you. Hopefully some of Joanna's words have been helpful to some degree or another to understand what we're going through, what you're going through. And it might be able to mitigate or even open the door for you to start your process of healing. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kirsten. Wow, so many issues, so many points for us to think about and reflect. And really, it looks like it's in our hands to make our lives a little happier, right? Make ourselves into something different than we have been, like you said. One thing that came to mind, Kirsten, and now letting everybody know that we are going to be opening. Kirsten will be so nice of keep talking to us a little longer and taking some questions. So make sure to send your questions. Meantime, some of our thoughts as you were speaking and questions that we might think it would be relevant to talk about. Some people or some even beliefs shown us or tell us that the more we suffer, the more we evolve. There is some of this misrepresentation of God as the punishing us, and therefore we should take everything and resign ourselves. And maybe, have you heard about these people commenting or thinking that way? How does Spiritism can bring us this suffering idea as not something we need to, when you say endure, but not really just to keep it and get it deeper in our lives?
So what I'm hearing you ask, Tanya, is, how does one not stay in that mode of anguish and suffering, and as a form of, we're bad and we're punished. This idea of, crime and punishment, and then God is a punisher and we must be punished. Sort of like that old belief system of, you're a sinner, thus you must go to hell for it. So I think depending upon each person, it might be more challenging or less challenging for certain people to eradicate that deeply embedded idea. And one of the things we would ask first of that person is to say, how is that belief benefiting you? Because it's very likely that that person, if they're posing that question, if they're thinking about it or going through that, they're not experiencing a lot of joy in their life. So how is that very belief helping you? It's not. So that would warrant us to redress or reframe our understanding. That rather, it's not about crime and punishment, but it's more so like an analogy of a rough diamond. So when you find a diamond out in nature, in its natural state, if you will, it's very rough, crude looking. I don't know if anyone's ever actually looked at one. You can Google that and look at it online. It's not very pretty at all, but it goes through a refinement process. And at the end, we see this beautiful gem, and it's that sparkling and it's beautiful. That is us, within this rough exterior that a lot of us present or, show to the world, is this diamond underneath all those layers, is this beauty within us. So it's not about crime and punishment. It's not that. And I know that we have experienced this as well, where many people have come to us and said, well, I'm going through suffering because I was a bad person in a previous life, and that's just what it is. Not really. Not exactly. What it's about is that sometimes we make not so great choices that lead to certain consequences. And it happens. We should extend self-forgiveness, compassion, and grace to ourselves, but also simultaneously be able to be open to the idea that I have to face the things that I have done or may have done, and be able to begin to live a better life. Now, some people might say, well, I don't really remember what I did, but you can still today, even if you're not even sure where to begin, even if you're not like saying, oh, I don't have any immense suffering. I mean, I have some issues, but nothing really big. It's still and always a good idea to begin to set goals for yourself, to have a sense of purpose in life, to know what's driving us, to educate ourselves, and to discipline ourselves. Those are some excellent points that I think Joanna brings for us to start. I think it went off a little bit of a tangent there, Tanya, but I hope I answered your question.
No, you did. Yeah, no, doing ourselves harm to ourselves instead of God punishing us, that says it all. So we can do the right things and expect having better results, right? And
Right.
like you mentioned, forgiveness and all that. I mean, it's about time that we learn all that, right?
Yeah,
We have a question from Bob O. And Bob says, with regard to reparative action, do you have any thoughts about restorative justice at the social level?
Wow. If you see my eyes turning to the other side, it's because it's the nature of how my screens are. And I wanted to look over to Bob's question again. So with regard to reparative action, do you have any thoughts about restorative justice at the social level? That is a fantastic question and couldn't be more appropriate for what we're experiencing now. Really, in every decade, in every age, in every century, there's always social injustices and things that need to be changed. So in terms of having thoughts about restorative justice, so in the Spirits book, they tell us a couple of things. They tell us a lot of things, actually. Spirits book by Allan Kardec, tell us that evil exists because those that are good are almost silent, or they are shy. You know, those who commit heinous crimes or injustices are just, in a sense, you know, brave, or brazen rather, and they just go out and do things. So we who know how to do better, we who know what is just and what is good, should speak up. You know, there are so many social injustices and things that are occurring on our planet that various people are witnessing. You know, it's a fad right now. If you go on social media and you see these video clips of two people fighting in the street, and usually there's at least one or two comments amidst the hundreds of comments of, why is someone just standing there filming it? Why isn't anyone intervening? Why isn't anyone calling 911? It almost becomes like an epidemic in and of itself, that some people enjoy watching that level of disturbancy, when instead, those who are in that crowd, instead of egging people on or even judging for what's going on, trying to assist and step in as best we can. Now, not every situation might feel warrants you to go in and step in. Maybe you're afraid, you're not sure. We understand that. But it's better for us to take personal responsibility when each and every one of us are out in society, even the smallest of things. So for instance, I give you an example of a story that I heard from a young person. This is obviously pre-COVID-19, and they were telling us a story that they were in school. Something similar actually happened to me as well growing up. Actually, I'll share my story because it makes more sense. When I was a teenager in high school, there was a girl who was notoriously bullied. And all throughout our elementary school, she was, and of course through high school. And this one particular day, me and some friends were sitting in the lunchroom area, and there were a group of guys throwing food at her, just like throwing French fries at her, and they were like laughing and cracking up, thinking this was the most hilarious thing in the world. And it just was their form of enjoyment. So me and some of friends, people that were sitting around us, of course, you notice the scene happening, and it feels like it's in slow motion. And in that moment, we had a choice. You know, we could be a bystander and judge and say, "Oh, those people are so bad. Look at what they're doing to that girl." Or you could stand up and go over to that guy and say, "What are you doing? This is wrong. Would you do that to your sister or your mom? Would you want someone doing this to your sister or somebody that you care about?" That's what we ended up doing. A group of friends walked over to this jock, this rather popular person, and just said, you know, and not in a very, you know, you're a horrible person kind of way, but like, "Man, what are you doing? This is wrong." And, you know, we've never forgotten his face, because he kind of was taken aback by it, because obviously no one had ever said anything to him about it. And he had a large group of his peers that were, you know, egging him on and coaching him to keep doing it and encouraging him. Here, just a few of us walked over and said something to him, and then he was so taken aback that he just stopped. I think he was just more shocked. So those are oftentimes things that we don't really think about necessarily. We might think, well, I'm one person. This is so small. That's insignificant. There are larger issues going on at hand, larger social injustices. Yes. Let us not forget, you know, what social media and media in general project. Let us not be fooled by what, you know, or always believe what we see on TV. What's more important is that within your own communities, within your own families, within your neighborhoods, to begin to implement this self-awareness, to be helpful to others, to be kind to others, and to step in when necessary. for those who are unable to stand up for themselves. Because all of that, all those small things add up to a changing society. So Jesus said that in order for kingdoms to change, man must change. So we can't expect an entirety generation of people to change without each individual in their own right taking the time out to change themselves. So I hope, Bob, that kind of give you a little bit of insight.
Yeah, it's each one of us and all of us, right? When you talk about society, sometimes we forget we are inserted in it. We are responsible. We want somebody else to do the miracle for us, right? So it's a great answer. So we have here a class that came from the United States Spiritist Federation's page. It says, you mentioned that Joanna says that real cure only happens when the therapy uproots its causes. But what if we had past life trauma and do not recall what happened, yet we still feel disturbed?
Great question. Great question. And I think Joanna kind of addresses or alludes to this. And I posted one of the quotes at the end of the PowerPoint, where it's kind of like this, and breaking down the most layman's easiest way to explain it is that we may not be able to verify in this life what we've done in a previous life. But one of the things that Joanna oftentimes teaches in the writings in Spiritism is she says that, yes, we do have forgetfulness of the past, but one thing that always carries over with us is that emotional memory. That's why we have cases of people who are experiencing mental illness for no apparent reason. No apparent reason. There's no explainable, there's no cause in this life, yet they have this immense major depressive disorder or anxiety or what have you without any real cause. So we know that to be true, and we see that. So how do I know, like you asked the question, how do I know if I'm really fixing that? If I don't know what to uproot? Well, it's a matter of a journey that we go through with ourselves. Because ultimately, as we begin to implement different techniques and therapies, sometimes medications even, we begin to feel the effects of it. So once we have uprooted, as Joanna shared, I think I can go back, or no, I can't go back in my slideshow, but one of the things that she says is that the actual end of suffering therefore occurs when the cause is eradicated, and then the consequences naturally disappear. What are the consequences? Our sadness, our despair, our anguish. So the more we begin to implement different therapeutic techniques, whether it's going to our spiritist centers as well and educating ourselves, receiving passes, yoga or meditation, which Joanna talks a lot about in her books, implementing different things and seeing their effects. We don't have to know, and sometimes it's highly discouraged for us to find out who we were in a previous life or what horrors we might have committed because we're curious, or sometimes not curious, we just wanted to know. Because it might even be more disturbing. If you're already feeling disturbed as it is now, imagine remembering the details. So what's most important is that we work on ourselves and we work towards paying attention to how we're feeling. As we're implementing different therapeutic techniques, as we're studying, as we're disciplining ourselves, as we're setting goals for ourselves, that we become acutely aware of our own emotional state. They call that the emotional IQ, which became, I think, famous in like the 90s with Dr. Daniel Goleman, the emotional intelligence and understanding that significance. So it's also really important for us to understand that. We believe that's what Joanna has actually brought to Spiritism, is this idea and understanding of the need of healthy emotional and mental states. And it's not just about the physical, but it's about, the mental and our emotions that we are experiencing in life as well. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, sure. That's always the point. We have really to see ourselves as spirits, right? I mean, the moment that we set goals, those goals, they cannot just be material goals. Otherwise, it's very hard to be completely happy, right? Or in a way, in a more, in a broader way, right? This is very temporary. Everything is so temporary if we get stuck into this kind of goals, right, Kirsten?
Yeah, absolutely.
We have one more question here from Yasko Arakawa. Yes, I think, as I recall from my grandparents, Buddhist saying, just accept you did not do well in the past life. So try to do better, not rebel, not to ask too many whys. And then she also brings another point in a different comment that complements what she's saying there. Easterners seem to face pain, suffering, as fact of life, with serenity, acceptance, instead of despair, rebellion. Is that perception pain lower or mental psychological basis play a role? So I guess kind of we put them together from what she learned from her family and bringing that question.
Thank you, Yasko, for sharing that and participating. So definitely, our upbringing, the idea of nature versus nurture, our upbringing, our surroundings, the social norms of the ways in which we grow up, undoubtedly affect our perceptions. And as we know, our perceptions are our realities. So however we're taught and made to understand is normal. So if we're taught to see death or suffering or hardships as just something we just accept and move on from, then of course, as we ourselves endure those very things, it might be easier for us to endure those things versus Western society that has very different views. So undoubtedly that affects us for sure, and how we understand our pain level. Is our pain tolerance different from them? I think it's just a matter of perspective. And so, yes, undoubtedly, I guess it does end up sort of changing our pain tolerance, if you will, because we're taught differently to experience pain. It's very common in Western society to be taught and educated and, be built into us that when a loved one dies, you must go through pain and suffering. And I remember a friend of ours lost his father, and I remember him sharing that he, in the beginning, was kind of disturbed, not by the fact that his father passed away, but by the fact that he wasn't so disturbed by it, because he felt like, well, that's what society told him. But he didn't. He felt at peace with it. But he was so conflicted because that's what he was taught. That's what he knew. That's what he had learned. But yet, that's not how he felt. So it's just interesting for us to do that self-evaluation and be more self-aware and to understand these different social constructs and understand the environment and the culture that we're growing up in has an effect on how we view life. And once we can acknowledge what those things are, we'll be able to change them and be open to new ideas, which in the book Happy Life, Joanna has a beautiful message where she starts out by saying, be open to new ideas. So we have to be open-minded to think and see different perspectives. I hope I answered your question, Yasko.
Sure. Let's see. We have some more time. Hold on. I need to, again, some technical things.
No problem.
My cursor decided not to help me. Here we go. Okay. We have a question from Jose Marcos. Kirsten, would please comment the saying, pain is necessary because we are in a world of trials and atonements, but suffering is everyone's choice. I think you kind of touched that, but maybe you can say a little more.
Yes, we have definitely heard that before. Pain is necessary and suffering is optional. And so it's a really great saying to sort of deeply reflect on, because inevitably we're going to go through hardships and experience anguish and just pain. But suffering to us in our, limited understanding, please go and do, your own research and study more of Joanna and Spiritism to get more in-depth understanding. But in our limited understanding, suffering, there reaches a point where, much like when we discuss the guilt complex, there reaches a point where, yes, we have to acknowledge what we've done. We will suffer because of that. We will feel the pain of that. But there comes a point where we have to say enough is enough. We have to stop self-sabotaging and get out of that loop, that cycle of, self-hatred and being unable to forgive ourselves, or being just stuck in that loop of negativity in order for us to be able to move on. Because ultimately, the person who pays the most is us. We can experience and will experience pain in our lives, but to suffer long and hard, people often mistaken crying and tears and suffering as a means of payback. In the book Action and Reaction, they actually talk about this. Mentor Celis, I believe it is, talks about this and clarifies. If not Celis, it's one of the other mentors in the book, that people often think that, when you've committed an error and then you suffer, people think, oh, the suffering is part of my reparative process. It's actually not. It's just a consequence. So the more we stay within that loop of suffering and sadness and despair and anguish, the harder it is for us to get out of, and the longer we'll be stuck there. So the point is for us to forgive ourselves or maybe others, whatever the situation warrants, and begin a reparative process. Begin to rebuild your emotional and physical life. So I hope I touched on what he was asking.
Yeah. Instead of being this toxic kind of guilt, right, Kirsten?
Yes.
Yeah.
Instead of staying in this idea of, victimhood, sometimes we're stuck in this mindset of, oh, I'm a victim. And it's, yes, you may have gone through something very difficult. You might have experienced a deep emotional, physical trauma. And indeed, it was not right. But we are not victims, because when we see ourselves purely as victims, we diminish ourselves and we don't allow ourselves an opportunity to be something else.
Yeah, in talking about forgiveness, there is a question, how can someone forgive and move on from a crime that they are still suffering emotional trauma from? What if the crime was something very abhorrent and heinous?
Great question. So how do we move on from emotional trauma or something that we're still suffering from? First and foremost, extending ourselves grace. Must extend ourselves grace. What does that mean? Joanna talks a lot about this in various different books. This idea of self-compassion, that we are allowed to experience what we're experiencing. Sometimes as spiritists, as Christians, or as people who have higher ideals in life, we tend to really judge ourselves very harshly. And we don't allow ourselves the time that we need to heal and understand that forgiveness is a process, and that to process trauma is not something easy. There are many different modalities that exist out there today in the world of psychology. Some of the more recent ones that are referred to as IFS, which is internal family systems. Sidebar, this is not a spiritist therapeutic technique. However, in studying some of it ourselves, and in also having studied and continue to study and read about Joanna, it syncs up very well with what she teaches and shares and what Spiritism shares. And it's just something basic. It was brought about by Dr. Richard Schwartz maybe 5-10 years ago. And basically is just addressing different parts of ourselves. And this is a great modality to use for those who are going through suffering. If someone is experiencing the consequences of trauma and are unable to forgive or move on because they're still going through that active phase, that is an opportunity for us of growth, because we're going to have to step out of our comfort zone and ask for help from a professional, which is completely okay, because there's great modalities nowadays that we have out there. Like I said, IFS, internal family systems. There's other types of therapeutic techniques that they teach. They even teach guided meditation, and so many other different resources we could utilize. Our spiritist centers, which we know most of them, if not all, are closed because of COVID, but there still are a lot of meetings that are going on, such as this online, that you can participate in to begin to calibrate our emotions. But let's not put this heavy burden on ourselves that as soon as we go through a hardship, we have to get over it immediately. Not everyone's at that same level. And we have to extend that grace to ourselves. We always recommend people to do their internal work. Go on YouTube and look for loving kindness patient. It's basically, it's in essence, a prayer to ourselves. And in the book by Joanna, Open Your Heart and Find Happiness, chapter in that book that she talks about prayer. And she says how important it is for us to learn to pray for ourselves. It's great and wonderful and beautiful that we pray for others. And it's okay if we ask someone else to pray for us. But we must and should get into the habit of praying for ourselves. Why? Because the effects it has on the energetic level of it bringing us out of that moment of despair, raising our vibrations, and actually allowing our spirit guides, our mentors, our spirit friends, or even people around us to access us, to inspire us to higher ideals and ideas of life. So in a nutshell, to answer a very complicated question, that would be what I would suggest.
Yeah, and we do not need to do it alone,
Exactly.
right? Like you said, there's so many resources. And also check around and see other people that are not just resources for us, but as we're helping others, that also help ourselves, right? I mean, sometimes we think we're in that positioning of helping, and we're the first one that benefit from that as well. And resources in every direction. You mentioned therapy, and there's the Spiritist centers and our friends and family. We do not need to stay in that state of mind on our own, and pay attention to our needs, going inward, right, Kirsten? It's very key. Well, I guess we can go to our last question. We after that, we'll ask you if you can do some final remarks for us, and then we will abuse a little bit and ask if you can do our final prayer right after.
Sure.
Okay? So we can go in that order. So the question that we have is suffering going completely away in the world as we transition to a planet of regeneration?
Wonderful question. Suffering going completely away in the world as we transition to a planet of regeneration. Completely going away. Well, as we are transitioning, and let's be reminded of that word, transitioning, and if we understand the different levels of worlds that Spiritism brings to us, we know that the world of regeneration is not the end and perfect happy world. So inevitably, we're still going to experience some level of frustration, some suffering, because it's yet still not a perfect world. But we will notice a most definite diminishing, little by little, from a vast majority, just across, socially, we'll begin to see it. And again, it's not going to be something where it is a flipping of a switch, where it's like from one day to the next, all of a sudden, we're going to see huge changes. But those changes are occurring now as we speak. Someone brought the question about social injustices. We have pioneers in the area of social well-being and those who are working for the benefit of humanity, not under the guise of any particular religion or belief system, other than the belief of wanting to be good to their neighbor. So we're seeing more and more people like that in our world, and we're seeing more and more people being inspired by that. We know that when we turn on social media or the media in general, we tend to see a lot of negative. We tend to see a lot of bad things that are happening. And we always encourage people. There's a website called the Good News Network, where all they share is good news, because there's so much goodness in the world. But we become so desensitized or so enveloped in media that only shares the negative. But there's a lot of positive things going on. That's what we shared earlier. Don't allow yourselves to be misled by what you're seeing on TV. Yes, there are a ton of crimes still going on, but there are a lot of positive things that have happened as well. Even with this COVID-19, a lot of people becoming more self-aware, a lot of families realizing that they weren't appreciating themselves, they weren't appreciating those around them or their kids. A lot of positive things. Are there negative things happening too? Of course, but this is a process. This is the state in which we're living in and the state that we're at. But definitely, as we progress, of course, we're going to see a decline, because suffering and the purpose of pain and suffering is for us to grow and to become refined. And as we're becoming more refined, we need less and less of those mechanisms to refine us, because we're already reaching those levels. So I hope I've answered the question. Oh, I think you're on mute. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, no, I like some of the comments also that we are seeing there from people thanking you, and we definitely thank you for the inspiration, the push actually for us to take the responsibility of our own happiness, right? So our growth, our all the love that is within us. So I thought you touched really in so many aspects that are important for us, not just to keep living our lives in this passive mode, right? Like you said, victimizing ourselves and looking just at the negative. There's so much beauty. And yeah, there is suffering, and we're learning how to deal with that until we are able to get rid of it, right? One day.
Exactly.
So it was really, really good. So if you can now, I don't know if you still have something else before the prayer they would like to share with us. You already gave us so much to take with us and think about and learn. But if you want to just finalize and do our prayer, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much, Kirsten.
Absolutely. And if final words would be, if I could leave anything with our viewers and those who are watching, is that there's always hope, and that there's always, it's darkest right before the dawn. And it's very true. My mother used to say growing up that when a woman is giving birth, the most painful part is right before the baby is born. And then once the baby is there, it's that joyous moment. So when we're at our most difficult point in our lives, where we're suffering, we're experiencing pain, it means we're about to come into a phase in our lives of deep spiritual and emotional growth. So let's hang in there, seek out the resources that we can, and continue to try to live as best as we can in this life. So thank you again for those who have been watching. And we can just transition, Tanya, into our prayer. So we always ask everyone to close their eyes. And the reason we ask that is that it's so much easier for us to meditate and to put ourselves into an emotional state where we're connecting with our mentors and our spirit guides and just elevating our thoughts and our minds. So join me in closing your eyes and let's open up our hearts for immense gratitude for these moments to be together, to reflect on these great ideas and ideals of life. We thank you, dear God, our model and guide, Jesus, our mentors and guides, and such organizations such as the United States Spiritist Federation, for being and giving a space, an opportunity for those who are suffering to receive this soothing balm of understanding and love, of the opportunity of peace, and to find peace within themselves. We also take this opportunity, dear Creator, and our spirit guides of love and light, for those who are truly suffering on this earth, those who've gone through recent suffering because of this pandemic, whether it's through losing someone, experiencing that, or just the experience and the stress. We ask that you comfort their hearts and their minds. And for those who are the forgotten in society, those who are left alone and suffering, we pray for them. And we pray that we may always be a vessel and a vehicle for this divine message of love. And we pray that in every opportunity, in the smallest of instances, may we be used for love and to assist the good spirits. We thank you in Jesus' name, so be it.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, everyone who watched live, those who will be watching afterwards. Many, many lessons to learn with our lovely Joanna de Angelis, always learning from her. And thanks, Kirsten, for bringing that to us. Next week, our series of talks continue with Alex Alves. And the topic will be Restart and Rebuild, our friend from Florida. So please join us at that time. It will be always a pleasure to have everyone here. And let's have a great weekend. Thank you.